The moment I realized my 9-year-old son Lucas had been deliberately poisoned by someone I trusted completely, my entire world shifted on its axis. Standing in the emergency room at Cedar Valley Medical Center, watching doctors pump activated charcoal into my child's small body, I knew with bone-deep certainty that this wasn't an accident. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The woman responsible sat 3 chairs away in the family waiting area, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face, playing the role of the devastated school nurse who had done everything possible to save him. What she didn't know was that I had already begun connecting dots that would expose not just her systematic abuse of innocent children, but a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of our community's medical establishment. 6 months earlier, I thought I was living proof that hard work and good intentions could create the perfect family life. My name is Lauren Hayes, and at 34, I had built what everyone in Willow Creek considered an enviable existence. My husband Marcus ran the most respected orthopedic practice in our Colorado mountain town, specializing in complex joint reconstructions that drew patients from across the region. Our son Lucas was thriving in 4th grade at Summit Ridge Elementary, and I had successfully transitioned from my demanding career as a pharmaceutical sales representative to freelance medical writing, allowing me the flexibility to be present for every soccer game and school event. Our home in the exclusive Aspen Ridge development reflected the success Marcus had achieved through 15 years of surgical excellence. The contemporary mountain architecture, with its soaring windows and stone fireplace, provided the perfect backdrop for the dinner parties and professional gatherings that had become central to our social life. I took genuine pride in creating an environment where Marcus could decompress from the intense demands of reconstructive surgery while maintaining the professional relationships that kept his practice thriving. Marcus and I had met during my pharmaceutical sales days, when I was representing a new line of orthopedic implants to surgical practices throughout Colorado. He had impressed me immediately with his thoughtful questions about implant longevity and patient outcomes, demonstrating the kind of clinical depth that separated exceptional surgeons from merely competent ones. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours as we discussed everything from titanium alloy composition to post-surgical rehabilitation protocols. The romance that developed from that professional foundation felt solid and intellectually stimulating. Marcus appreciated my understanding of medical device technology and pharmaceutical interactions, while I admired his dedication to achieving optimal patient outcomes regardless of the time and effort required. When he proposed during a weekend ski trip to Vail, promising a partnership built on mutual respect and shared commitment to excellence, I believed we could create something extraordinary together. The early years of our marriage had exceeded those expectations. Marcus established his reputation as the surgeon other physicians consulted for their most challenging cases, building a practice that balanced clinical excellence with genuine compassion for patients facing life-altering injuries. I continued my pharmaceutical career until Lucas was born, then gradually shifted toward medical writing projects that allowed me to use my industry knowledge while maintaining flexibility for family priorities. Lucas represented everything we hoped to achieve as parents. He inherited Marcus's analytical precision and my curiosity about how things worked, excelling academically while maintaining the kind of easy social connections that made him genuinely popular with classmates and teachers. His passion for baseball and robotics reflected interests we could support enthusiastically, and watching him develop into a confident, kind young person felt like our greatest accomplishment. Willow Creek itself provided the ideal environment for raising a family with our values and aspirations. The town of 12,000 people offered excellent schools, abundant outdoor recreation, and the kind of tight-knit community where neighbors knew each other's children and local businesses supported youth sports teams. Marcus's practice anchored us in the community's professional leadership, while my volunteer work with the hospital foundation and school district connected us to families who shared our priorities. The first indication that our carefully constructed life might be more fragile than it appeared came on a crisp October morning when Marcus mentioned a staffing change at Lucas's school over breakfast. We were sitting at our kitchen island, morning sunlight streaming through the oversized windows that showcased the aspens beginning their fall color transformation, when he casually dropped information that would eventually shatter everything I believed about our family's security. Summit Ridge hired a new nurse practitioner for their health clinic, he said, scrolling through emails on his phone while sipping the espresso I'd prepared with our Italian machine. Stephanie Walsh. I worked with her at Denver General during my residency years. Excellent clinical skills, particularly with pediatric emergency situations. The comment seemed routine at the time. Marcus's professional network extended throughout Colorado's medical community, and his recommendations carried significant weight in healthcare hiring decisions. When Summit Ridge's administration had requested his input on candidates for their expanded health services position, his endorsement of Stephanie Walsh had apparently been decisive in her selection. "That's wonderful," I replied, refilling his coffee cup while mentally adding another item to my growing list of fall volunteer commitments. Lucas will benefit from having someone with that level of expertise available during school hours. Lucas bounded into the kitchen at that moment, backpack already loaded with textbooks and the robotics project he'd been perfecting for weeks. At 9 years old, he possessed the kind of boundless energy and intellectual curiosity that made parenting both exhausting and exhilarating. His enthusiasm for learning and natural athleticism suggested he would thrive regardless of whatever minor challenges elementary school might present. "Dad, can you help me with my science fair project tonight?" he asked, grabbing the turkey sandwich I'd prepared and stuffing it into his lunch bag with characteristic 9-year-old efficiency. "I want to demonstrate how different joint prosthetics affect range of motion, but I need help with the anatomical diagrams." Marcus's face lit up with the particular joy he experienced when Lucas showed interest in medical concepts. "Absolutely. We can use some of the models from my office to show how knee replacement components interact with surrounding tissue structures." Their shared fascination with orthopedic engineering had become one of my favorite aspects of their relationship. Marcus approached Lucas's questions with the same respect and thoroughness he brought to medical consultations, never talking down to him or oversimplifying complex concepts. Lucas thrived under this intellectual attention, developing sophisticated understanding of anatomical systems that impressed his teachers and sparked deeper curiosity about how the human body functioned. As I drove Lucas to school that morning, listening to him explain his latest theories about why certain baseball pitchers seemed immune to shoulder injuries, while others required surgery after relatively minor trauma, I felt the familiar surge of gratitude for our circumstances. We had created exactly the kind of family environment where intellectual curiosity flourished, where professional success supported rather than compromised family relationships, and where community connections enriched rather than complicated our daily lives. Summit Ridge Elementary reflected the community's commitment to educational excellence. The modern facility, completed just 3 years earlier, incorporated the latest thinking about learning environments and technology integration. Class sizes remained manageable, teacher retention was excellent, and parent involvement was both expected and genuinely welcomed. Lucas's teacher, Mrs. Davidson, had quickly recognized his academic potential and consistently provided appropriate challenges to keep him engaged. The school's decision to expand health services by hiring a nurse practitioner, rather than relying solely on a traditional school nurse, demonstrated the kind of forward-thinking leadership that had attracted us to the district. Many elementary schools struggled to provide adequate health support for students with chronic conditions or unexpected medical emergencies. Having someone with Stephanie Walsh's background would significantly enhance the school's ability to handle complex health situations. Over the following weeks, I heard consistently positive reports about Stephanie's integration into the Summit Ridge community. Other parents praised her thorough approach to health assessments, her excellent communication with families about student medical needs, and her obvious competence in handling everything from routine medication administration to minor emergency situations. "She's incredibly knowledgeable," commented Janet Morrison, whose daughter required daily asthma medication monitoring. "She explains everything clearly, asks thoughtful questions about symptoms and triggers, and obviously understands pediatric respiratory conditions at a level that goes far beyond typical school health support." These endorsements reinforced my confidence in Marcus's professional judgment and Summit Ridge's hiring decision. Quality healthcare professionals were apparently difficult to recruit to smaller communities, and Stephanie's willingness to apply her advanced training in an elementary school setting suggested genuine commitment to child welfare rather than simply career advancement. My first personal interaction with Stephanie came in early November, when Lucas developed what appeared to be a minor stomach bug during school hours. The call came while I was working on a complex medical device marketing analysis for a client in Denver, deep in research about titanium surface treatments that would optimize bone integration. "Mrs. Hayes, this is Stephanie Walsh, the nurse practitioner at Summit Ridge. I have Lucas here in my office. He's been feeling nauseated since lunch, and while his vital signs are stable, I think it would be wise for you to pick him up so he can rest at home." Her voice projected exactly the kind of professional competence and caring concern that any parent would want to hear from their child's healthcare provider. I immediately saved my work, gathered my keys, and headed to school with the mild worry that accompanies any unexpected call about your child's well-being. When I arrived at the health clinic, Stephanie exceeded my already high expectations. She was strikingly professional in appearance. Shoulder-length blonde hair styled in a way that looked both polished and practical, minimal but expertly applied makeup, and scrubs that somehow managed to look designer rather than institutional. Her manner with Lucas was warm but appropriately clinical, as she explained his symptoms and the assessment she'd conducted.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He came in around 1:30 complaining of nausea and mild abdominal discomfort, she explained, reviewing detailed notes she'd taken during his visit. Temperature is normal, blood pressure is excellent, and he doesn't show signs of dehydration or acute distress. Sometimes children need quiet time at home to recover from minor digestive upsets. Her thoroughness impressed me. Many school health providers might have simply checked for fever and sent students back to class unless symptoms were obviously severe. Stephanie's comprehensive assessment and detailed documentation suggested she took every student's comfort and well-being seriously, regardless of how minor their complaints might appear. Lucas looked pale but alert as we prepared to leave, clearly feeling better after resting in the clinic's comfortable examination room. Stephanie handed me a written summary of his visit, including specific observations about symptom onset, vital sign measurements, and recommendations for home care. "Your husband mentioned you have a background in pharmaceutical sales," she said as we reached the clinic door. "I'd love to get your perspective on some pediatric medication questions that come up in school health settings. Would you be interested in having coffee sometime to discuss how schools can better support students with chronic health conditions?" The request seemed both professional and community-minded. School health providers often struggled with complex medication management issues, and my pharmaceutical background could indeed provide useful insights about drug interactions, dosing considerations, and communication with prescribing physicians. Stephanie's interest in improving pediatric care quality aligned perfectly with the kind of community involvement that had always characterized my volunteer activities. I gave her my contact information and suggested we meet the following week. As Lucas and I drove home, he chattering about the interesting medical equipment he'd observed in Stephanie's clinic, I felt pleased with both her obvious competence and her desire to collaborate with parents who had relevant professional expertise. That evening, Lucas recovered completely from whatever minor digestive issue had disrupted his school day. He ate a normal dinner, completed his homework without difficulty, and spent an hour working on his robotics project with typical 9-year-old focus and enthusiasm. By bedtime, the entire episode seemed like the kind of minor health hiccup that punctuates childhood without creating lasting concern. Marcus arrived home that night with his usual combination of physical tiredness and emotional satisfaction from a day spent helping patients regain mobility and independence. His practice had handled everything from a complex revision hip replacement to a young athlete's torn meniscus, and he always found deep fulfillment in using his surgical skills to restore function and eliminate pain. "How did Lucas like working with Stephanie?" he asked as we cleaned up after dinner, Lucas upstairs absorbed in a book about mechanical engineering principles. "She was excellent," I replied honestly. "Very thorough with her assessment, great communication skills, and obviously knowledgeable about pediatric health issues. She asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss medication management challenges in school settings." Marcus nodded approvingly. That sounds like Stephanie. She's always been interested in improving systems and protocols, rather than just treating individual cases. During residency, she constantly researched better approaches to patient care coordination and family communication. His endorsement reinforced my positive impression. Marcus's clinical judgment was consistently excellent, and his respect for colleagues was never given casually. If he valued Stephanie's professional approach and intellectual curiosity, she was undoubtedly well qualified for her position at Summit Ridge. Our coffee meeting took place the following Thursday at Mountain View Cafe, a local establishment that served as an informal gathering place for Willow Creek's professional community. Stephanie arrived exactly on time, carrying a leather portfolio and dressed in casual clothes that somehow looked more expensive and coordinated than my own carefully chosen outfit. Her questions about pharmaceutical considerations in school health settings demonstrated sophisticated understanding of pediatric medication challenges. She asked about drug interaction protocols, appropriate communication with prescribing physicians, and strategies for supporting students whose chronic conditions required complex medication regimens during school hours. I'm particularly interested in developing better systems for emergency medication administration, she explained, sipping her coffee with the kind of precision that suggested careful attention to personal wellness choices. Many schools lack clear protocols for handling situations where students need rapid intervention for conditions like severe allergic reactions or diabetic emergencies. Her focus on emergency preparedness impressed me. School health providers often faced life-threatening situations with limited resources and support, and Stephanie's proactive approach to protocol development suggested she understood the serious responsibilities that came with her position. During our conversation, she mentioned her background in emergency medicine and her decision to transition from hospital work to school-based healthcare. Hospital emergency departments can be emotionally overwhelming, she explained. Working with children in an educational environment allows me to focus on prevention and wellness, rather than crisis management. It's more sustainable personally while still allowing me to use my clinical training meaningfully. Her explanation made complete sense. Many healthcare professionals sought work environments that provided better work-life balance while still utilizing their specialized skills effectively. School-based positions offered regular schedules, vacation time that aligned with family needs, and the opportunity to build ongoing relationships with children and families. By the end of our meeting, I felt confident that Summit Ridge had made an exceptional hiring decision. Stephanie's combination of advanced clinical training, thoughtful approach to system improvement, and obvious dedication to child welfare represented exactly what families needed from school healthcare providers. December brought an increase in Lucas's visits to the health clinic, though the symptoms remained relatively minor and seemed to follow predictable patterns. Some days he complained of headaches. Others experienced stomach discomfort or general fatigue. Stephanie's calls were always appropriately concerned and professionally detailed, her documentation thorough, and her recommendations reasonable. During one pickup, I mentioned the frequency pattern to Stephanie, wondering if we should consult Lucas's pediatrician about possible underlying causes for these recurring episodes. I've been considering the same thing, she replied thoughtfully. Sometimes children develop minor health patterns related to growth spurts, seasonal changes, or academic stress. His symptoms don't suggest anything serious, but a comprehensive pediatric evaluation could provide valuable insights. Her suggestion reflected exactly the kind of clinical judgment I respected, taking symptoms seriously without creating unnecessary alarm, while recommending appropriate medical consultation when patterns emerged that warranted further investigation. That evening, I discussed the situation with Marcus over dinner. Lucas was playing in our family room, apparently feeling fine after another morning pickup from the health clinic. Maybe we should schedule a comprehensive checkup with Dr. Reynolds, I suggested. Stephanie thinks it might be worth ruling out any underlying factors that could be contributing to these recurring symptoms. Marcus considered this while reviewing patient charts he'd brought home for evening documentation. Stephanie's clinical instincts have always been excellent, he said finally. If she recommends a pediatric evaluation, it's definitely worth pursuing. Sometimes children experience phases where their systems are more sensitive to environmental changes or stress factors. His support for Stephanie's recommendation felt reassuring. As healthcare professionals, both Marcus and Stephanie understood the importance of comprehensive evaluation, when symptom patterns emerged, even if individual episodes seemed minor. Their collaborative approach to Lucas's care reflected the kind of thorough medical support that validated our choice of community and schools. The pediatric appointment was scheduled for the week after winter break. Dr. Reynolds had been Lucas's physician since birth, and her thoroughness and excellent rapport with children had guided us through everything from routine immunizations to developmental milestone assessments. If anyone could identify underlying factors contributing to Lucas's recent health patterns, it would be her. Meanwhile, Stephanie's integration into the broader community continued smoothly. She volunteered for the Hospital Foundation's winter fundraising campaign, contributed valuable expertise to discussions about school emergency preparedness protocols, and quickly became a respected voice in healthcare policy conversations among Willow Creek's medical professionals. During various community gatherings throughout December, I heard consistently positive feedback about Stephanie's work at Summit Ridge. She had handled several minor emergency situations with calm competence, provided excellent support for students with chronic health conditions, and demonstrated particular skill with anxious children who needed emotional reassurance along with medical attention. "She's like having a pediatric emergency room right in the school," commented Dr. Patricia Chen, whose son had received care for a playground injury that could have required emergency room treatment. "Her assessment skills are incredible, and she knows exactly when situations require immediate medical intervention versus care that can be managed in the school setting." These consistent endorsements from other medical professionals reinforced my belief that Summit Ridge had recruited someone with exceptional qualifications. Quality healthcare providers were apparently difficult to attract to smaller communities, and Stephanie's willingness to apply her advanced training in an elementary school represented exactly the kind of community commitment that made Willow Creek special. The only slightly discordant note in this overwhelmingly positive picture came during a chance encounter at the grocery store just before Christmas. I was selecting items for our holiday dinner when I noticed Stephanie in the pharmacy section, speaking quietly but intensely into her phone while waiting for a prescription to be filled. Something about her posture and facial expression suggested the conversation was personal and emotionally charged, though I couldn't hear specific words from my position near the produce section. What struck me was the contrast between her usual professional composure and the obvious distress evident in her body language during this private phone call. "This has to stop," I heard her say as I moved closer to the pharmacy area, though the context remained unclear. "I can't keep managing this situation, and people are starting to ask questions that I can't answer." She noticed me approaching and quickly ended the call, immediately returning to the warm, professional demeanor I'd come to expect from our school and community interactions. We exchanged pleasant holiday greetings and discussed plans for the winter break, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd glimpsed something unexpected beneath her carefully maintained public persona. Walking to my car, I reflected on the brief moment of apparent vulnerability I'd witnessed. Everyone deserved privacy in their personal lives, and Stephanie's emotional phone conversation only made her seem more human and relatable. Healthcare professionals faced numerous personal and professional stressors, and maintaining perfect composure at all times was neither realistic nor healthy. That same week brought Dr. Reynolds' comprehensive evaluation of Lucas's recent health patterns. The appointment included detailed discussion of symptoms, thorough physical examination, and laboratory work to screen for potential underlying conditions that might explain the recurring episodes at school. "Everything appears completely normal," Dr. Reynolds reported after reviewing all test results. "His growth and development are progressing perfectly, laboratory values show no signs of infection or nutritional deficiency, and his physical examination reveals no concerning findings. Sometimes children experience phases of increased sensitivity to minor stressors or environmental factors." Her assessment provided reassurance but didn't offer definitive explanations for why Lucas had been experiencing more frequent health issues at school. Dr. Reynolds suggested continued monitoring and consideration of environmental or psychological factors that might be contributing to his symptoms. "Have there been any significant changes at school or home that might be affecting his stress levels or comfort?" she asked. "New teachers, altered routines, family circumstances, or social dynamics that could be creating anxiety?" I considered her questions carefully. The only major change had been Stephanie's arrival as the new nurse practitioner. but that seemed more likely to improve rather than compromise Lucas's school health experience. His teachers remained consistent, our family routines were stable, and he appeared to be thriving socially with his classmates. Nothing significant comes to mind, I replied honestly. If anything, having such qualified healthcare support at school should be reducing rather than increasing any health-related concerns. Dr. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes these patterns resolve naturally as children adapt to developmental changes or seasonal transitions. Let's continue monitoring his symptoms, and please contact me immediately if you notice any new or concerning changes. Her balanced approach felt entirely appropriate, taking the symptoms seriously without creating unnecessary worry about conditions that weren't supported by clinical evidence. As we left the appointment, I felt grateful for both Dr. Reynolds' thoroughness and Stephanie's attentive care at school. January brought a return to normal school routines after winter break, and initially, Lucas seemed to experience fewer health episodes. The additional rest and family time during vacation appeared to have reset whatever minor stress factors might have been contributing to his symptoms during the fall semester. However, as winter progressed into February, a new pattern began emerging that would ultimately force me to question everything I thought I understood about the people I trusted most in my carefully constructed world. The transformation in Lucas's health patterns became impossible to ignore by mid-February. What had begun as occasional visits to Stephanie's clinic evolved into a concerning routine that disrupted his academic progress and social activities. More troubling was the subtle shift in his personality. The confident, curious boy who had always embraced challenges was becoming anxious and withdrawn, particularly about school attendance. On a snowy Tuesday morning that would later prove pivotal in unraveling the truth, Lucas complained of severe abdominal pain that prevented him from eating breakfast or getting dressed for school. His distress seemed genuine and intense, far beyond the minor discomfort that had characterized his previous episodes. I called Summit Ridge to report his absence and scheduled an emergency appointment with Dr. Reynolds. Something's different about this episode, I explained to Marcus as he prepared to leave for an early surgery. He's never been this uncomfortable, and he seems genuinely frightened about the pain, rather than just feeling unwell. Marcus examined Lucas briefly, noting the tenderness in his lower abdomen and the elevated anxiety accompanying his physical symptoms. It could be appendicitis, he said grimly. We should get him to Dr. Reynolds immediately, and if she's concerned, we'll need emergency imaging studies. The urgency in Marcus's voice alarmed me more than Lucas's symptoms themselves. As an orthopedic surgeon, Marcus rarely encountered abdominal emergencies, but his medical training allowed him to recognize when situations required immediate professional evaluation. If he was concerned enough to mention appendicitis, Lucas's condition was potentially serious. Dr. Reynolds' examination that morning was thorough and methodical. She palpated Lucas's abdomen carefully, checking for specific signs of appendiceal inflammation while asking detailed questions about symptom onset and progression. Her expression grew increasingly concerned as the evaluation continued. I want to get some blood work and an ultrasound to rule out appendicitis, she said finally. His presentation isn't classic, but we can't afford to miss an acute abdominal emergency in a child this age. The next several hours passed in a blur of medical procedures and mounting anxiety. Blood tests showed elevated white cell counts suggesting inflammation, while ultrasound imaging revealed concerning fluid accumulation in Lucas's abdominal cavity. Dr. Reynolds consulted with pediatric surgeons at Denver Children's Hospital, ultimately recommending immediate transfer for further evaluation and potential emergency surgery. As I sat in the passenger seat of the ambulance racing through mountain highways toward Denver, holding Lucas's hand while paramedics monitored his vital signs, I experienced the particular terror that accompanies watching your child suffer from something beyond your control. Nothing in my pharmaceutical background or medical writing experience had prepared me for the helplessness of being unable to ease his pain or answer his frightened questions about what was happening to him. The emergency department at Denver Children's Hospital operated with the kind of controlled urgency that characterizes pediatric medical centers. Within minutes of arrival, Lucas was surrounded by specialists conducting examinations, ordering additional imaging studies, and discussing treatment options with the calm efficiency that comes from extensive experience with childhood emergencies. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the pediatric surgeon assigned to Lucas's case, provided the first reassuring news we'd received all day. The CT scan shows inflammation and fluid accumulation, but his appendix appears normal, she explained after reviewing the imaging results. This presentation suggests acute gastroenteritis with significant inflammatory response, possibly triggered by a bacterial or viral infection. Her diagnosis offered relief from the immediate fear of emergency surgery while raising new questions about what could have caused such a severe inflammatory reaction. Lucas had shown no signs of typical gastroenteritis symptoms. No fever, vomiting, or diarrhea, that would explain the intensity of his abdominal inflammation. Have you noticed any pattern to his symptoms or possible exposure to contaminated food or water? Dr. Mitchell asked. Sometimes children develop severe inflammatory responses to bacterial toxins or viral infections that don't follow typical presentation patterns. I described the recurring health episodes Lucas had experienced at school over the past several months, emphasizing that his symptoms had been minor and inconsistent until this acute episode. Dr. Mitchell listened thoughtfully, taking detailed notes about the timeline and progression of his health concerns. I'd like to keep him overnight for observation and supportive care, she decided. We'll monitor his inflammatory markers and ensure he's stable before discharge. Sometimes these episodes resolve with rest and symptom management, but we want to be certain there's no underlying condition requiring treatment. That night, sitting beside Lucas's hospital bed while he slept fitfully under the influence of pain medication, I found myself questioning everything I thought I understood about his recent health patterns. The severity of this episode seemed disproportionate to anything he'd experienced previously, and the absence of typical gastroenteritis symptoms suggested we might be dealing with something more complex than routine childhood illness. Marcus arrived from Willow Creek after completing his surgical schedule, still wearing scrubs and carrying the tension that accompanied his transition from professional duties to family crisis management. His medical training provided comfort in navigating hospital systems and understanding treatment protocols, but his role as Lucas's father made him as vulnerable to fear and helplessness as any parent facing their child's unexplained illness. The pediatric surgeon seems excellent, he said after speaking with Dr. Mitchell about Lucas's condition and treatment plan. Her assessment is thorough, and she's taking appropriate precautions without unnecessary intervention. Whatever caused this episode, he's getting optimal care. His confidence in the medical team provided some reassurance, though questions about the underlying cause of Lucas's symptoms continued to trouble me throughout the night. As I dozed fitfully in the uncomfortable hospital chair, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something important about the pattern of his recent health episodes. Lucas recovered gradually over the next 2 days, with his inflammatory markers returning to normal ranges, and his abdominal pain subsiding under careful medical management. Dr. Mitchell remained puzzled by the severity of his presentation without clear infectious or structural causes, but his improvement suggested that whatever had triggered the episode was resolving appropriately. Sometimes children experience these kinds of inflammatory responses without identifiable causes, she explained during discharge planning. His recovery has been excellent, and all follow-up tests show normal results. We'll want to monitor him closely and investigate further if similar episodes occur. Her recommendation for ongoing vigilance felt both reassuring and ominous. While Lucas was clearly recovering well from this acute episode, the lack of definitive explanation left us vulnerable to future occurrences of whatever had caused his severe symptoms. The drive back to Willow Creek provided time for reflection about the broader patterns surrounding Lucas's health over the past several months. As mountain scenery passed outside the car windows and Lucas dozed peacefully in the back seat, I found myself mentally reviewing every interaction with school health services and every conversation about his minor symptoms that had preceded this major episode. Something about the progression from minor complaints to severe inflammatory crisis felt too dramatic to be coincidental. While children certainly experienced unexplained health episodes, the timing and escalation of Lucas's symptoms suggested factors beyond routine developmental or environmental influences. That evening, after settling Lucas at home with instructions for gradual return to normal activities, I called Stephanie to update her about his hospitalization and explain his expected absence from school. Her response seemed appropriately concerned and professionally supportive, though something about her tone struck me as slightly off in ways I couldn't immediately identify. "I'm so relieved he's okay," she said, though her voice carried an undertone that didn't quite match the words. Acute abdominal episodes in children can be frightening for families. I'm glad the Denver team was able to determine it wasn't appendicitis or another surgical emergency. Her knowledge of his specific diagnosis seemed oddly detailed for someone who hadn't been directly involved in his medical care. While school health providers certainly received updates about students' major health events, her familiarity with the diagnostic process and treatment decisions suggested she'd been more closely monitoring his situation than typical school protocols would require. "We're still puzzled about what triggered such a severe episode," I mentioned, hoping her clinical experience might provide insights about possible environmental or infectious causes. Dr. Mitchell couldn't identify any obvious source of inflammation or infection. "These things sometimes remain mysterious," Stephanie replied quickly. "Children's immune systems can react unpredictably to various triggers. The important thing is that he's recovering well and will hopefully avoid similar episodes in the future." Her dismissive response felt inconsistent with the thorough, analytical approach she'd demonstrated in previous conversations about pediatric health issues. Someone with her background and intellectual curiosity should have been more interested in exploring potential causes and prevention strategies for such a significant health event. After ending the call, I sat in our kitchen reviewing the conversation and trying to understand why Stephanie's responses had felt inadequate or evasive. Perhaps I was being overly sensitive after the stress of Lucas's hospitalization, but her lack of clinical curiosity about his condition seemed uncharacteristic of the engaged healthcare professional I'd come to know. Lucas returned to school the following Monday with medical clearance from Dr. Reynolds and specific instructions about activity restrictions during his recovery period. I walked him to his classroom that morning, partly to ensure he felt comfortable returning to the environment where his health episodes had been occurring, and partly to observe his interactions with teachers and staff who had been involved in managing his previous symptoms. Mrs. Davidson greeted Lucas with warm enthusiasm and appropriate concern about his recent hospitalization. She had prepared modified activities to accommodate his gradual return to full participation, while ensuring he wouldn't feel excluded from classroom routines. Her obvious care for his well-being and thoughtful approach to his transition back to school reminded me why we valued Summit Ridge's educational environment. "Please don't hesitate to call if Lucas experiences any discomfort or concerns," she said as I prepared to leave. "We'll monitor him closely and ensure he has support for whatever he needs during his recovery." Her genuine concern and professional competence provided comfort as I left Lucas in the school's care. Whatever had caused his recent health crisis, he was returning to an environment where multiple adults were committed to his safety and well-being. The first few days of Lucas's return to school passed without incident. He participated in modified activities, ate lunch normally, and seemed to be regaining his typical energy and enthusiasm for learning. His teachers reported no signs of discomfort or anxiety, and he returned home each afternoon, with positive accounts of his school day. However, by Thursday of that week, familiar patterns began to reemerge. Lucas complained of mild stomach discomfort during lunch and visited Stephanie's clinic for assessment and rest. She called me with her usual professional concern, recommending pickup for home observation given his recent hospitalization and ongoing recovery needs. "I want to be extra cautious with Lucas given what he experienced last week," she explained when I arrived to collect him. "His symptoms are minor, but we can't afford to miss early signs of another inflammatory episode." Her cautious approach seemed medically appropriate, and I appreciated her attention to potential complications related to his recent illness. Lucas looked pale but comfortable as we prepared to leave, reporting that rest in the clinic had helped him feel better. However, as I gathered his backpack and school materials, I noticed something that would later prove significant in understanding the truth about his health episodes. On Stephanie's desk, partially hidden beneath other papers, was a small vial of clear liquid with a pharmaceutical label that seemed oddly out of place in a school health setting. The glimpse was brief, and the text too small to read from my position, but something about the vial's appearance triggered my pharmaceutical background knowledge. Most school health clinics maintained limited medication inventories, focused on basic first aid supplies, and emergency medications like epinephrine auto-injectors. The presence of what appeared to be a specialized pharmaceutical preparation suggested either unusual student health needs or practices that extended beyond typical school nursing protocols. "Is that for a student with a chronic condition?" I asked casually, gesturing toward her desk area while attempting to get a better view of the vial's labeling. Stephanie's response was quick and slightly defensive. "Oh, that's just a medication sample I picked up from a pharmaceutical representative for potential future use. Sometimes we get samples of pediatric formulations that could be useful for students with chronic conditions." Her explanation seemed plausible but felt inconsistent with standard school health policies I understood from my pharmaceutical sales background. Most school districts maintain strict protocols about medication storage and administration that would prohibit keeping unlabeled samples or medications not specifically prescribed for individual students. As we drove home, I found myself mentally reviewing what I'd observed in Stephanie's clinic. The vial's presence might have been entirely innocent, but the defensive nature of her response suggested she was uncomfortable with my question. Someone with her clinical background and professional confidence should have been able to discuss medication protocols without apparent anxiety. That evening, I decided to research school health medication policies to better understand what types of pharmaceutical preparations were typically maintained in educational settings. My pharmaceutical background provided access to professional databases and regulatory information that might clarify whether Stephanie's medication practices aligned with standard protocols. What I discovered during several hours of research that night would fundamentally change my understanding of everything that had been happening to Lucas over the past several months. School health clinics operated under strict regulations about medication storage, administration, and documentation that made Stephanie's explanation about sample medications highly problematic. According to federal and state regulations governing school health services, all medications maintained in educational settings must be specifically prescribed for individual students, properly labeled with patient information and dosing instructions, and stored according to pharmaceutical stability requirements. The practice of keeping unlabeled samples or medications not prescribed for specific students violated multiple regulatory standards and could result in serious legal consequences for both the healthcare provider and the school district. More concerning was my growing realization that the timing of Lucas's health episodes corresponded closely with periods when he would have been under Stephanie's care in the school clinic. Children experiencing minor symptoms that brought them to her attention were precisely the population who would have access to whatever medications she might be administering outside normal protocols. The pharmaceutical vial I'd glimpsed could have contained any number of substances, from benign saline solutions to medications with serious physiological effects. Without proper labeling and documentation, there was no way to verify what Lucas or other students might have been given during their visits to the health clinic. As these disturbing possibilities crystallized in my mind, I realized I needed professional guidance about how to investigate my suspicions without compromising Lucas's safety or jumping to conclusions that might be unfounded. The stakes were too high, and the potential consequences too serious to proceed without expert advice about appropriate next steps. Friday morning brought another concerning episode that would force me to confront the growing evidence that Lucas's health problems were not coincidental. He woke feeling fine, ate breakfast normally, and expressed enthusiasm about a robotics competition scheduled for that afternoon. However, within 2 hours of arriving at school, Stephanie called reporting severe nausea and requesting immediate pickup. When I arrived at the clinic, Lucas was lying on the examination table looking genuinely distressed and considerably worse than when I dropped him off that morning. Stephanie was documenting his vital signs and appeared appropriately concerned about his rapid deterioration. His symptoms came on suddenly during second period, she explained, showing me the detailed notes she'd taken about his condition. Temperature is normal, but he's experiencing significant nausea and reports feeling dizzy when he sits up. Her clinical assessment seemed thorough, and her concern appeared genuine, but I found myself studying her demeanor and responses with new suspicion based on my research the previous evening. Someone who was deliberately causing Lucas's symptoms would need to project exactly this kind of professional competence and appropriate worry to avoid detection. As I helped Lucas gather his belongings, I noticed that the pharmaceutical vial I'd observed the previous day was no longer visible on Stephanie's desk. Its absence could have been innocent, perhaps properly stored in a locked medication cabinet. But the timing of its disappearance felt significant given my growing concerns about her medication practices. "Has Lucas been drinking enough water today?" I asked, attempting to engage Stephanie in conversation that might provide insights about her interactions with him during the morning. "I encouraged him to increase his fluid intake when he first reported feeling unwell," she replied smoothly. "Sometimes mild dehydration can contribute to nausea and dizziness, especially in children who are still recovering from recent illness." Her response was clinically appropriate, but something about her tone and body language suggested carefully rehearsed answers rather than spontaneous clinical reasoning. Someone with her background should have been more curious about potential causes of Lucas's rapid symptom development, particularly given his recent hospitalization. As we drove home, Lucas dozed fitfully in the passenger seat while I wrestled with the growing conviction that his health episodes were being deliberately caused by someone I had trusted completely. The evidence remained circumstantial, but the patterns were becoming too consistent and concerning to dismiss as coincidental. That afternoon, while Lucas slept off whatever had caused his morning symptoms, I made the decision that would ultimately expose the truth about everything that had been happening to him. I called Dr. Reynolds to discuss my growing concerns about the frequency and pattern of Lucas's health episodes, particularly their apparent connection to school attendance. "I'm starting to wonder if there might be environmental factors at school that are contributing to Lucas's symptoms," I explained carefully, not wanting to make accusations without evidence, while ensuring she understood the seriousness of my concerns. Dr. Reynolds listened thoughtfully to my description of the timing patterns and symptom progression. Her response indicated she shared my growing unease about the situation. "That's a concerning pattern that warrants investigation," she said. "Children can certainly develop sensitivity to environmental allergens or chemical exposures in school buildings, but the acute nature of Lucas's episodes suggests something more specific than typical environmental triggers." Her willingness to take my concerns seriously provided validation for pursuing further investigation. As a pediatrician with extensive experience, Dr. Reynolds understood the difference between routine childhood illness patterns and situations that suggested external causative factors. "I'd like to document Lucas's symptoms more systematically and consider some specialized testing that might identify specific exposures or substances that could be causing his reactions," she continued. "If there are environmental hazards at school, other children could be at risk as well." Her mention of other potentially affected children crystallized my growing sense of urgency about the situation. If my suspicions about Stephanie were correct, Lucas might not be the only student experiencing deliberately induced health problems. The scope of potential harm extended far beyond my family to include dozens of other children who trusted school health services to protect, rather than endanger their well-being. That weekend, I began keeping detailed records of Lucas's symptoms, activities, and interactions with school personnel. My pharmaceutical background provided useful frameworks for documenting potential medication exposures and physiological responses that could help identify causative factors if my suspicions proved correct. More importantly, I started researching the background and professional history of Stephanie Walsh. If she was deliberately harming students, there might be previous incidents or warning signs that had been overlooked during the hiring process. My investigation would require careful attention to legal and ethical boundaries, but the potential danger to children justified thorough examination of available public records. What I discovered during my weekend research would shatter any remaining doubt about the deliberate nature of Lucas's health problems and reveal a pattern of deception that extended far beyond simple medical malpractice. The woman I had trusted with my child's welfare was not who she appeared to be, and her presence at Summit Ridge Elementary represented a threat that demanded immediate action to protect Lucas and every other student under her care. My weekend investigation into Stephanie Walsh's professional background revealed disturbing gaps and inconsistencies that transformed suspicion into certainty. Using professional databases accessible through my pharmaceutical industry contacts, I discovered that her nursing license had been suspended twice in other states before her arrival in Colorado, suspensions that should have appeared in any thorough background check conducted by Summit Ridge Elementary. The first suspension occurred 3 years earlier in Oregon, where Stephanie had worked at a pediatric clinic specializing in chronic pain management. According to disciplinary records filed with the state nursing board, She had been investigated for unauthorized medication administration to children whose parents had specifically declined certain treatments. The case had been settled quietly with a 6-month license suspension and mandatory ethics training, but the underlying pattern was unmistakable. More troubling was a second incident in Nevada, where Stephanie had been employed by a school district similar to ours. Hospital emergency departments in that region had reported an unusual cluster of children presenting with symptoms suggesting medication overdoses, all of whom had visited their school health clinic on the days their symptoms developed. The investigation had been inconclusive due to lack of direct evidence, but Stephanie had resigned her position during the inquiry and left the state shortly afterward. The Nevada incident had occurred just 18 months ago, meaning Stephanie's employment at Summit Ridge represented a continuation of a pattern rather than an isolated occurrence. Her ability to secure positions despite these concerning incidents suggested either inadequate background checking by employers or deliberate concealment of her disciplinary history. Armed with this information, I faced the complex challenge of exposing her activities without compromising Lucas's immediate safety or alerting Stephanie to my suspicions before proper authorities could intervene. The situation required coordination with medical professionals, law enforcement, and school administrators while maintaining the appearance of normal family routines. Monday morning brought another test of my ability to maintain composure while knowing Lucas was potentially walking into danger. He seemed completely recovered from Friday's episode and was excited about resuming his robotics project after missing the previous week's competition. Watching him bounce into Summit Ridge with his typical 9-year-old enthusiasm while knowing what I'd discovered about Stephanie's background required every ounce of self-control I could summon. Instead of returning home after drop-off, I drove directly to Dr. Reynolds' office for the emergency consultation I'd scheduled over the weekend. Her response to the evidence I presented about Stephanie's professional history was swift and decisive. "This information changes everything about how we need to approach Lucas's health episodes," she said, reviewing copies of the disciplinary records I'd obtained. "We're no longer looking at environmental factors or mysterious illness patterns. We're dealing with potential criminal activity that requires immediate intervention." Her willingness to take serious action provided the professional validation I needed to move forward with formal complaints and investigations. As Lucas's physician, Dr. Reynolds had both the authority and responsibility to report suspected child abuse to appropriate agencies, while her medical expertise would be crucial in documenting evidence of deliberate poisoning. "I want to admit Lucas to the hospital for comprehensive toxicology screening," she continued. "If Stephanie has been administering unauthorized medications, we need to identify what substances might be involved and ensure there are no lingering effects on his health." The prospect of another hospitalization was distressing, but the medical necessity was clear. Proper toxicology testing required specialized laboratory facilities and expert interpretation that could only be provided in a hospital setting. More importantly, Lucas would be safe from further exposure while we gathered evidence about what had been done to him. Dr. Reynolds also recommended immediate contact with Colorado's Child Protective Services and the State Medical Board to report suspected medication abuse by a licensed healthcare provider. These agencies had specialized investigative capabilities and legal authority to protect other potentially affected children while building criminal cases against perpetrators. "We'll need to coordinate carefully with law enforcement to ensure evidence is preserved and other children are protected," she explained. School-based medication abuse cases require complex investigations involving multiple agencies, but they also carry serious criminal penalties when prosecuted successfully. Her systematic approach to protecting Lucas while building a case against Stephanie provided hope that justice would be achieved and other children would be safeguarded. However, the complexity of the situation meant that resolution would take time, during which I would need to maintain appearances while Lucas underwent medical evaluation. That afternoon, I called Summit Ridge to report Lucas's absence due to a medical appointment that might extend through the week. I spoke with the main office rather than the health clinic, avoiding direct contact with Stephanie while providing plausible explanations for his temporary absence from school. The conversation with school administrators would need to happen soon, but Dr. Reynolds advised waiting until we had completed initial toxicology testing and contacted appropriate investigative agencies. Premature disclosure could allow Stephanie to dispose of evidence or alter her practices in ways that would compromise the investigation. Lucas's admission to Denver Children's Hospital that evening was presented as precautionary follow-up to his previous hospitalization, which provided cover for the extensive testing Dr. Reynolds had ordered. The toxicology screening would examine blood and urine samples for dozens of potential medications and toxic substances that could have been administered without proper medical supervision. "We're going to run some tests to make sure you're completely healthy after being sick last week," I explained to Lucas as we completed admission procedures. "The doctors want to be extra careful and check for anything that might have caused your stomach problems." His acceptance of this explanation reflected the trust children place in their parents and medical professionals to make decisions in their best interests. The irony that we were protecting him from someone who should have been providing care rather than causing harm was not lost on me as I watched him settle into his hospital room. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the pediatric toxicologist assigned to Lucas's case, brought both expertise and reassuring competence to the complex medical evaluation ahead. Her experience with suspected poisoning cases provided crucial guidance about what substances to test for and how to interpret results in the context of deliberate medication administration. School-based medication abuse typically involves easily accessible drugs that produce symptoms mimicking common childhood illnesses, she explained during our initial consultation. Perpetrators often use substances like anti-nausea medications, mild sedatives, or drugs that affect blood pressure in ways that create convincing symptoms without causing obvious harm. Her description aligned perfectly with Lucas's pattern of symptoms: nausea, dizziness, fatigue, and abdominal discomfort that had seemed genuine but resolved quickly once he was removed from the school environment. Someone with Stephanie's clinical knowledge would understand exactly how to create believable illness presentations without causing immediately life-threatening complications. The toxicology testing process required multiple blood draws over 48 hours to detect substances with varying elimination rates from the body. Some medications could be identified days or weeks after administration, while others required testing within hours of exposure to be detectable. We'll also analyze hair samples, which can reveal medication exposure over longer periods, Dr. Walsh continued. If someone has been administering drugs to Lucas regularly over several months, hair analysis should provide clear evidence of chronic exposure. The scientific thoroughness of the investigation provided confidence that we would obtain definitive answers about what had been done to Lucas, regardless of how cleverly Stephanie might have concealed her activities. Modern toxicology testing was sophisticated enough to detect even trace amounts of medications that had been administered weeks earlier. While Lucas underwent medical evaluation, I met with Detective Michael Torres from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's Crimes Against Children Unit. His experience with institutional abuse cases provided crucial insights about the legal process ahead and the evidence necessary to build successful prosecutions. Healthcare provider abuse cases are particularly complex because perpetrators have legitimate access to victims and detailed knowledge of how to cause harm while avoiding detection, he explained during our first interview. However, they also tend to be overconfident about their ability to manipulate medical systems, which often leads to evidence trails that support criminal prosecution. Detective Torres outlined the investigation process, which would involve coordination between multiple agencies to examine Stephanie's activities, protect other potentially affected children, and gather evidence for criminal charges. The complexity required patience, but the systematic approach would ensure comprehensive accountability. We'll need to interview other families whose children have had unusual health episodes at school, review medical records for patterns consistent with medication abuse, and examine the school's health clinic for unauthorized substances or equipment, he continued. The investigation will take several weeks, but cases like this often reveal extensive evidence once agencies begin looking systematically. His confidence about building a strong case provided reassurance about eventual justice, though the immediate priority remained protecting Lucas and other children from further harm. The investigation would proceed carefully to avoid alerting Stephanie while gathering evidence that would support serious criminal charges. On Wednesday morning, preliminary toxicology results confirmed my worst fears about what had been happening to Lucas. Dr. Walsh called with news that would fundamentally change how we understood every health episode he'd experienced over the past several months. "We've identified traces of ondansetron in Lucas's system," she reported. It's an anti-nausea medication commonly used in hospital settings, but it's not something a healthy child would have any reason to receive, especially not in the doses we're detecting. Ondansetron was a medication I recognized from my pharmaceutical background, a powerful drug used to prevent nausea in cancer patients receiving chemotherapy or patients recovering from major surgery. In healthy children, it could produce exactly the kind of symptoms Lucas had been experiencing, particularly if administered in inappropriate doses or combinations. More concerning is that we're also finding traces of promethazine, another anti-nausea drug that shouldn't be present in a healthy child, Dr. Walsh continued. The combination suggests someone has been deliberately administering these medications to create symptoms that would require medical attention. The deliberate nature of Lucas's poisoning was now medically confirmed. Someone with access to hospital-grade medications and knowledge of their effects had been systematically drugging my child to create the appearance of legitimate illness requiring intervention and care. Hair analysis will provide more detailed information about the timeline and frequency of exposure, Dr. Walsh explained. Based on what we're seeing in blood tests, I suspect we'll find evidence of regular medication administration over several months. The systematic nature of Lucas's abuse was becoming clear through scientific evidence that would be impossible for Stephanie to explain away. No legitimate medical scenario could account for the presence of multiple prescription medications in a healthy child's system, particularly medications that were not available in typical school health settings. Armed with this evidence, Detective Torres accelerated the investigation timeline. Search warrants were obtained for Stephanie's home, car, and workplace, while interviews began with other families whose children had experienced unusual health episodes during the current school year. We're treating this as an active child endangerment case with potential for additional victims, he informed me. The toxicology evidence provides probable cause for immediate action to protect other children while we gather evidence for criminal prosecution. The legal machinery of child protection was finally engaging on Lucas's behalf, but the emotional impact of knowing he had been deliberately poisoned by someone we trusted was overwhelming. The violation felt personal and professional, attacking both my role as his mother and my confidence in the medical systems I'd worked within for years. Thursday brought the arrest that I had been both anticipating and dreading. Detective Torres called early that morning to inform me that Stephanie Walsh had been taken into custody at her home on charges of child abuse, medication tampering, and practicing medicine without proper authorization. We found significant evidence at her residence, he reported. Multiple prescription medications that shouldn't be accessible to school health providers, detailed notes about individual students' health episodes, and equipment for preparing medication doses outside normal pharmaceutical protocols. The scope of evidence suggested that Lucas was far from Stephanie's only victim. Her systematic approach to acquiring and administering unauthorized medications indicated a pattern of behavior that had likely affected numerous children over an extended period. We're reviewing health records for every student who visited the school clinic during Stephanie's employment, Detective Torres continued. Early indications suggest at least 15 other children experienced unusual health episodes that correspond with clinic visits. The realization that Stephanie had been harming multiple children while projecting an image of caring competence was deeply disturbing. Parents throughout Willow Creek had trusted her with their children's health and safety, never imagining that her clinical expertise was being used to cause rather than prevent suffering. Summit Ridge Elementary was closed Thursday and Friday, while investigators processed the health clinic and interviewed staff members who might have observed concerning behaviors or practices. The school district issued carefully worded statements about an ongoing investigation affecting health services, but details were withheld to protect the integrity of criminal proceedings. Lucas remained hospitalized for observation while toxicology testing continued, but his physical recovery was progressing well. The psychological impact of learning that a trusted adult had been deliberately harming him would require careful attention and professional support, but his resilient spirit was already evident in his curiosity about the medical equipment and procedures surrounding his care. "When can I go back to school?" he asked repeatedly, eager to reunite with friends and resume normal activities. His question reflected both healthy resilience and the challenging task ahead of helping him understand why his return to Summit Ridge would be delayed, while ensuring his continued safety. Dr. Reynolds coordinated with child psychology specialists to develop appropriate strategies for explaining the situation to Lucas in age-appropriate ways that wouldn't traumatize him, while ensuring he understood the importance of reporting any unusual symptoms or interactions with healthcare providers in the future. Children are remarkably resilient when they receive proper support and honest explanations about what happened to them, the psychologist assured me. Lucas's recovery will depend more on how adults handle the situation going forward than on the trauma he's already experienced. Her guidance provided hope about Lucas's long-term well-being, while emphasizing the importance of professional support during his emotional recovery. The violation of trust represented by Stephanie's actions would require careful processing to avoid creating lasting anxiety about medical care or authority figures. By Friday evening, additional toxicology results revealed the full scope of Stephanie's medication abuse. Hair analysis showed evidence of regular exposure to various prescription drugs over a 4-month period, confirming that Lucas's health episodes had been artificially created from almost the beginning of Stephanie's employment at Summit Ridge. The pattern is consistent with someone systematically experimenting with different medications and dosages to create various symptom presentations, Dr. Walsh explained. It suggests a level of premeditation and clinical knowledge that makes this particularly serious from both medical and legal perspectives. The calculated nature of Lucas's abuse was more disturbing than random violence, because it represented deliberate exploitation of medical expertise and parental trust. Stephanie had used her professional knowledge and institutional access to harm children, while maintaining the appearance of providing excellent health care. Weekend brought a flood of calls from other parents whose children had experienced health episodes during Stephanie's tenure at Summit Ridge. The stories were remarkably consistent. Previously healthy children developing sudden onset symptoms that required clinic visits, temporary improvement followed by recurring episodes, and gradual escalation of symptom severity over time. Emma started having headaches almost every week after the new nurse arrived, reported one mother. She'd never had problems before, but suddenly she was coming home from school feeling sick all the time. Tyler began complaining about stomach pain that only seemed to happen at school, shared another parent. We took him to doctors, changed his diet, tried everything we could think of, but nothing helped until now. The pattern of previously healthy children developing school-specific health problems during Stephanie's employment was too consistent to be coincidental. Her systematic approach to selecting and drugging victims demonstrated a level of planning and manipulation that suggested experience with avoiding detection while causing maximum disruption to families. Detective Torres informed me that the investigation had expanded to include Stephanie's previous employment locations in Oregon and Nevada. Law enforcement agencies in those states were reopening cases involving suspicious patterns of childhood illness that had occurred during her tenure at healthcare facilities in their jurisdictions. We're discovering that this pattern of behavior extends back several years and across multiple states, he explained. Stephanie Walsh appears to have been engaging in systematic child abuse, disguised as medical care for much longer than we initially suspected. The scope of her criminal activity was staggering in its implications for families who had trusted her care in other communities. Children in Oregon and Nevada had likely suffered the same systematic poisoning that Lucas and his classmates had experienced, but their parents had never discovered the truth about the source of their symptoms. Sunday evening brought Lucas's discharge from the hospital with a clean bill of health and comprehensive documentation of the medications he had been given without consent. His physical recovery was complete, but the emotional processing of what had happened to him was just beginning. I don't understand why someone would want to make kids sick, he said as we drove home through familiar mountain scenery that now felt different after everything we'd experienced. Nurses are supposed to help people feel better. His confusion reflected the fundamental violation of trust that Stephanie's actions represented. Children expect adults in healthcare roles to protect and heal them, not to deliberately cause suffering for personal gratification or professional manipulation. Sometimes people who seem good on the outside are actually doing bad things, I explained carefully. It's not your fault, and it doesn't mean you can't trust other doctors and nurses who really do want to help you. The conversation was the first of many we would need to have about understanding evil disguised as caring, recognizing when something doesn't feel right, and maintaining healthy skepticism without becoming paralyzed by fear of all authority figures. As we pulled into our driveway in Aspen Ridge, I reflected on how completely our sense of safety and community trust had been shattered by discovering that someone we'd welcomed into our lives had been systematically harming our child. The recovery process would involve rebuilding confidence in institutions and people while learning from the experience, without allowing it to create lasting fear. Marcus was waiting in our garage when we arrived, having left his office early to be present for Lucas's homecoming. His relief at having our son safely home was visible, but the tension in his shoulders reflected the ongoing stress of knowing that someone he'd professionally recommended had used that recommendation to gain access to children she could abuse. The investigation is far from over, he said quietly as we watched Lucas run upstairs to reunite with his room and belongings. But at least we know he's safe now, and other children are being protected. His words acknowledged both the progress we'd made in exposing Stephanie's crimes and the ongoing work necessary to ensure justice for all her victims. The legal process would take months or years to complete, but the immediate priority of protecting children had been achieved through swift action by medical and law enforcement professionals. That night, as I sat beside Lucas's bed while he slept peacefully for the first time in months without the threat of deliberate poisoning, I began planning the advocacy work that would become my focus for years to come. No other family should have to experience the violation and fear we'd endured, and systemic changes were necessary to prevent similar abuse in educational and healthcare settings. The weeks following Stephanie's arrest revealed a conspiracy that extended far beyond one rogue healthcare provider's criminal actions. As investigators examined her personal effects and digital communications, they uncovered evidence of a coordinated scheme involving pharmaceutical diversion, falsified medical credentials, and connections to other healthcare workers engaged in similar abusive practices across multiple states. Detective Torres contacted me on a frigid December morning with news that would fundamentally alter my understanding of how Stephanie had operated undetected for so long. The search of her residence had yielded thousands of pages of documentation suggesting she was part of a network of healthcare professionals who shared information about evading detection while systematically abusing children in institutional settings. We found encrypted communications with at least 6 other individuals who appear to be engaging in similar activities in different regions, he explained during a conference call that included federal investigators from the Department of Health and Human Services. This isn't an isolated case of individual criminal behavior. We're looking at organized coordination of child abuse disguised as medical care. The revelation that Stephanie's crimes were part of a larger pattern transformed the investigation from a local criminal case into a federal inquiry involving multiple agencies with specialized expertise in healthcare fraud and organized child exploitation. The scope of potential victims expanded from dozens to potentially hundreds of children across numerous states and healthcare facilities. Agent Patricia Summers from the HHS Office of Inspector General explained the broader implications of what investigators were discovering. These individuals have been using legitimate healthcare credentials and employment to gain access to vulnerable populations while sharing techniques for avoiding detection and maximizing psychological impact on victims and families. Her description of the calculated nature of the abuse network was deeply disturbing. Stephanie hadn't been acting impulsively or alone. She had been part of a coordinated effort to exploit the trust inherent in healthcare relationships for the purpose of causing systematic harm to children while maintaining professional credibility. The federal investigation would examine how such a network could develop and operate within legitimate healthcare institutions, what systemic failures had enabled their activities, and how to implement safeguards that would prevent similar abuse in the future. The complexity of the case required specialized resources that exceeded local law enforcement capabilities. Meanwhile, the impact on Willow Creek's community was profound and far-reaching. Summit Ridge Elementary remained closed for additional investigation, while the school district implemented new health services protocols and provided counseling support for affected families. The violation of institutional trust had shaken parents' confidence in the safety measures designed to protect their children. Marcus found himself in the difficult position of having professionally recommended someone who had used that recommendation to gain access to children she could harm. His medical reputation and clinical judgment were being questioned by colleagues and community members who struggled to understand how such a fundamental assessment error could have occurred. I'm reviewing every professional interaction I had with Stephanie during our time at Denver General, he told me during one of our evening conversations about the ongoing fallout. I'm trying to identify any warning signs or concerning behaviors I might have missed that could have prevented this situation. His self-examination reflected the broader soul-searching happening throughout Willow Creek's medical community. Healthcare professionals were reviewing their own practices and relationships, wondering whether they might have unknowingly worked with other individuals capable of such calculated deception and abuse. The Colorado State Medical Board launched a comprehensive review of healthcare credentialing and background checking procedures that had allowed Stephanie to obtain employment despite her disciplinary history in other states. The investigation revealed systemic gaps in information sharing between state licensing agencies that enabled problematic healthcare providers to move between jurisdictions without disclosure of previous violations. Current systems rely heavily on self-reporting by license applicants about disciplinary actions in other states, explained Dr. Robert Hayes, the medical board's chief investigator. Stephanie Walsh deliberately concealed her previous suspensions and provided false information about her employment history that wasn't detected by standard verification procedures. The regulatory failures that had enabled Stephanie's employment at Summit Ridge were not unique to Colorado. Similar gaps existed in most states' credentialing systems, creating opportunities for healthcare providers with histories of misconduct to reinvent themselves in new locations where their backgrounds weren't properly scrutinized. As part of the expanding investigation, I was asked to provide detailed testimony about my observations of Stephanie's behavior and practices during her tenure at Summit Ridge. The federal investigators were particularly interested in my pharmaceutical background and ability to identify concerning medication practices that might have been missed by people without specialized knowledge. Your recognition that unauthorized pharmaceutical samples shouldn't have been present in a school health setting was crucial to exposing this situation, Agent Summers explained during my formal interview. We need to understand how someone without your professional background might have been able to identify similar warning signs. The focus on detection and prevention reflected the investigators' commitment to developing educational resources and protocols that would help parents, educators, and healthcare professionals recognize signs of institutional abuse before it reached the level of systematic harm that had occurred in Willow Creek. My testimony also addressed the psychological manipulation Stephanie had employed to maintain trust while conducting her abusive activities. Her professional competence, appropriate demeanor, and strategic community involvement had created a facade of credibility that made questioning her practices seem unreasonable or paranoid. She cultivated relationships with parents and school personnel that made her seem like an ideal healthcare provider, I explained. Her willingness to volunteer for school activities and her apparent dedication to child welfare created an image that was completely inconsistent with her actual behavior. The investigators were documenting how predatory individuals could exploit institutional settings and professional relationships to access victims while avoiding suspicion. Stephanie's case would become part of training materials for healthcare administrators, school personnel, and law enforcement professionals involved in child protection. January brought the beginning of legal proceedings that would consume months of preparation and testimony. Stephanie's defense team argued that her actions represented medical errors rather than deliberate abuse, claiming that her medication administration had been intended to help rather than harm the children under her care. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Maria Rodriguez, methodically demolished these claims using the toxicology evidence, documentation found in Stephanie's possession, and expert testimony about the calculated nature of her medication selections and dosing protocols. Medical errors don't involve systematic acquisition of unauthorized medications, detailed record-keeping about victim responses, and coordination with other individuals engaged in similar activities, Rodriguez argued during pretrial hearings. This evidence demonstrates deliberate, premeditated child abuse conducted by someone who exploited her medical knowledge to cause maximum harm while avoiding detection. The legal strategy focused on establishing that Stephanie's actions were not only criminal, but represented a fundamental violation of medical ethics and professional responsibilities that warranted severe penalties. The prosecution sought charges that would reflect both the individual harm caused to specific children and the broader damage to institutional trust and community safety. During this period, Lucas began working with Dr. Sarah Chen, a child psychologist who specialized in helping young victims of institutional abuse process their experiences and develop healthy coping strategies. The therapeutic work focused on helping him understand that what had happened wasn't his fault, while rebuilding his confidence in legitimate medical care. Children who experience abuse from trusted authority figures often struggle with knowing who to trust in the future, Dr. Chen explained during one of our family sessions. Our goal is to help Lucas develop discernment skills that will protect him without creating generalized fear of all healthcare providers or institutional settings. The psychological recovery process was complicated by Lucas's intellectual sophistication and his growing understanding of how extensively he had been manipulated. At 9 years old, he was capable of recognizing the calculated nature of Stephanie's deception, which made the violation of trust particularly profound. "I keep thinking about all the times she seemed so nice and worried about how I was feeling," he told Dr. Chen during one session. "It's confusing to know that someone can pretend to care about you while they're actually hurting you on purpose." His struggle to reconcile Stephanie's caring demeanor with her abusive actions reflected the complex psychological damage caused by betrayal from trusted caregivers. The therapeutic work would need to address not only the direct trauma of being poisoned, but also the more subtle impact of learning that appearances could be completely deceiving. Dr. Chen also worked with our family to develop strategies for recognizing and responding to legitimate medical concerns while maintaining appropriate vigilance about potential abuse. The challenge was helping Lucas regain confidence in healthcare relationships without becoming hypervigilant or fearful of necessary medical care. "We want Lucas to trust his instincts when something doesn't feel right while understanding that most healthcare providers are genuinely committed to helping children," she explained. "It's a delicate balance between appropriate caution and healthy trust in legitimate medical relationships." The therapeutic process extended beyond individual counseling to include support groups with other families affected by Stephanie's crimes. Sharing experiences with parents and children who had endured similar abuse helped normalize our reactions, while providing practical strategies for recovery and advocacy. February marked a significant breakthrough in the federal investigation when investigators identified the source of the pharmaceutical supplies Stephanie had been using to drug children. The trail led to a corrupt pharmacy technician in Denver who had been systematically diverting prescription medications and selling them to individuals without legitimate medical purposes. This discovery explains how Stephanie was able to access hospital-grade medications that shouldn't have been available in a school health setting, Detective Torres informed me during a case update. The pharmacy diversion scheme provided her network with a reliable supply of drugs that could be used to create convincing illness presentations. The pharmaceutical diversion operation had been supplying multiple individuals across several states with medications used for systematic child abuse. The investigation revealed that corrupt healthcare workers and pharmacy employees had created a black market for substances, specifically chosen for their ability to cause symptoms without creating immediately life-threatening emergencies. The complexity of the criminal network was staggering in its scope and organization. Participants had developed sophisticated protocols for medication administration, victim selection, and evidence concealment that suggested years of refinement and coordination. The level of planning and execution required had enabled them to operate undetected within legitimate healthcare institutions while causing extensive harm to children and families. Agent Summers explained that the investigation had identified similar patterns of suspicious child illness clusters in healthcare facilities across 8 states, all connected to individuals who had communicated with Stephanie through encrypted messaging systems. The geographic scope of the network suggested that dozens or potentially hundreds of children had been victimized by coordinated abuse disguised as medical care. "We're working with state and local agencies to conduct comprehensive reviews of every healthcare facility where these individuals have been employed," she said. "The goal is to identify all potential victims and ensure that affected children receive appropriate medical evaluation and psychological support." The systematic nature of the abuse network had implications for how healthcare institutions screened employees, monitored medication access, and detected unusual patterns of patient symptoms. The investigation was revealing multiple systemic vulnerabilities that had been exploited to facilitate widespread child abuse. March brought the preliminary hearing that would determine whether sufficient evidence existed to proceed with criminal prosecution. The courtroom was packed with affected families, community members, and media representatives covering what had become a nationally significant case involving institutional child abuse and healthcare corruption. Stephanie appeared in court wearing the kind of professional attire that had once projected competence and trustworthiness. Her demeanor remained composed and appropriate, demonstrating the same careful image management that had enabled her to deceive parents and colleagues for months while systematically poisoning children. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of deliberate criminal activity, including toxicology reports showing multiple unauthorized medications in affected children, detailed documentation found in Stephanie's possession describing victim responses to various drug combinations, and expert testimony about the calculated nature of her medication selections. Dr. Walsh, the pediatric toxicologist who had overseen Lucas's medical evaluation, testified about the impossibility of accidental exposure to the medications found in affected children's systems. These drugs don't occur naturally in school environments, and the combinations we detected could only have resulted from deliberate administration by someone with advanced knowledge of pharmacology and pediatric physiology. Her testimony established that Stephanie's actions required sophisticated medical knowledge and careful planning that was completely inconsistent with claims of accidental overdose or medical error. The evidence demonstrated systematic abuse conducted by someone who understood exactly how to cause specific symptoms while avoiding detection. Marcus testified about his professional relationship with Stephanie during their time at Denver General, acknowledging that he had seen no warning signs of the behavior that later emerged at Summit Ridge. His testimony highlighted how effectively Stephanie had maintained her professional facade while concealing her abusive tendencies from colleagues. She demonstrated excellent clinical skills and appropriate professional behavior during our work together, he said. Nothing in her performance or interactions suggested any concerning attitudes toward children or medication practices. His testimony reinforced the prosecution's argument that Stephanie's crimes represented carefully concealed predatory behavior rather than obvious mental illness or professional incompetence that should have been detected by colleagues or supervisors. I testified about my observations of unauthorized medications in Stephanie's clinic and the patterns I had identified connecting Lucas's symptoms to his school attendance. The prosecution used my pharmaceutical background to establish that someone without specialized knowledge might not have recognized the warning signs that had eventually led to exposing her activities. Mrs. Hayes's professional experience with pharmaceutical regulations enabled her to recognize that medication samples shouldn't have been present in a school health setting, Assistant DA Rodriguez argued. Her investigation ultimately protected not only her own child but potentially dozens of other children who were being systematically abused. The hearing concluded with Judge Patricia Williams ruling that sufficient evidence existed to proceed with criminal prosecution on multiple felony charges including child abuse, medication tampering, conspiracy, and practicing medicine without proper authorization. The ruling ensured that Stephanie would face serious criminal penalties, while sending a strong message about accountability for healthcare professionals who abuse their positions of trust. April brought the beginning of civil litigation as affected families filed lawsuits against Summit Ridge School District, the Colorado Department of Education, and various healthcare credentialing agencies that had failed to detect Stephanie's history of misconduct. The civil cases focused on institutional negligence and systemic failures that had enabled her employment, despite red flags that should have prevented her access to children. Our family's participation in the civil litigation was motivated not by financial considerations, but by the desire to force systemic changes that would prevent similar abuse in other communities. The legal process provided opportunities to examine and reform the institutional practices that had made Stephanie's crimes possible. These lawsuits are about ensuring that schools and healthcare systems implement safeguards that will protect future generations of children, explained our attorney David Mitchell, who specialized in institutional liability cases involving child welfare. The goal is comprehensive reform that addresses every level of failure that enabled this abuse. The civil litigation would examine background checking procedures, medication storage and monitoring protocols, staff supervision practices, and communication systems between healthcare licensing agencies. The comprehensive review aimed to identify and correct every vulnerability that had been exploited by Stephanie and her criminal network. As spring arrived in Willow Creek, the community began the slow process of healing from the violation of trust that had shattered assumptions about institutional safety. Summit Ridge Elementary reopened with new health services protocols, enhanced staff supervision, and comprehensive training about recognizing signs of potential abuse. Lucas returned to school with enthusiasm, tempered by newfound awareness of how appearances could deceive. His recovery had progressed remarkably well, but he approached relationships with authority figures with a healthy skepticism that would serve him throughout his life. "I feel good about going back to school," he told me as we prepared for his first day back at Summit Ridge, "but I'm going to pay attention to whether things feel right, and I'll tell you if anything seems weird." His ability to articulate both confidence and appropriate caution reflected the successful therapeutic work he had done with Dr. Chen. The experience had been traumatic, but it had also taught him valuable lessons about trusting his instincts and advocating for his own safety. The broader impact of Stephanie's crimes extended far beyond Willow Creek to influence healthcare credentialing practices, school health protocols, and child protection policies throughout Colorado and other affected states. The case had become a catalyst for systematic reforms designed to prevent similar abuse while maintaining the trust necessary for legitimate healthcare relationships. As I reflected on the journey from suspicion to justice, I recognized that our family's experience had transformed us from passive recipients of healthcare services into active advocates for child protection and institutional accountability. The violation we had endured became the foundation for work that would help protect other families from similar trauma, while strengthening the systems designed to keep children safe. The trial of Stephanie Walsh began on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after she had first arrived at Summit Ridge Elementary as the promising new healthcare provider who would enhance the school's ability to care for its students. The irony of the timing was not lost on anyone who had lived through the systematic deception and abuse that followed her arrival in our community. Sitting in the packed courtroom with Marcus and other affected families, I watched as Stephanie entered wearing the same composed professional demeanor that had once convinced us all of her dedication to child welfare. Her ability to maintain this facade, even while facing multiple felony charges, demonstrated the calculated nature of her criminal behavior and her skill at manipulating perceptions. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Assistant District Attorney Maria Rodriguez, laid out a compelling narrative of systematic child abuse disguised as medical care. The evidence would show that Stephanie had deliberately poisoned dozens of children while documenting their suffering for sharing with her criminal network of healthcare providers engaged in similar abuse across multiple states. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about the ultimate betrayal of trust," Rodriguez began. "The defendant used her medical knowledge and professional credentials to gain access to the most vulnerable members of our community, young children whose parents entrusted their care to someone they believed was dedicated to protecting their health and well-being." The prosecution would present toxicology evidence, victim testimony, documentation found in Stephanie's possession, and expert analysis demonstrating that her actions represented calculated criminal behavior rather than medical errors or mental illness. The systematic nature of her crimes and her coordination with other perpetrators would establish the deliberate intent necessary for felony convictions. Stephanie's defense attorney, Michael Barnes, argued that his client had been attempting to provide innovative medical care for children with complex health needs that traditional approaches had failed to address. He claimed that any harm caused had been unintentional and resulted from experimental treatments rather than malicious abuse. Stephanie Walsh dedicated her career to helping children, Barnes argued. While her methods may have been unconventional, her intent was always to alleviate suffering and improve the lives of the young patients under her care. The defense strategy of portraying systematic poisoning as misguided medical innovation was deeply offensive to the families who had watched their children suffer under Stephanie's care. The attempt to characterize deliberate abuse as well-intentioned treatment reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of both medical ethics and the evidence against her. The first week of testimony focused on establishing the scope and systematic nature of Stephanie's crimes. 17 families testified about their children's experiences with unexplained illness episodes that had occurred only during school hours and had resolved when their children were removed from Stephanie's care. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the pediatric toxicologist who had overseen Lucas's medical evaluation, provided detailed testimony about the medications found in affected children's systems. Her analysis demonstrated that the substances detected could only have been administered deliberately by someone with advanced pharmacological knowledge. These medications don't occur naturally in school environments, Dr. Walsh explained to the jury. The combinations we detected in multiple children's systems required sophisticated understanding of drug interactions and pediatric physiology. This was not accidental exposure or medical error. It was deliberate poisoning. Her testimony established the medical impossibility of innocent explanations for the toxicology findings, while demonstrating the calculated expertise required to achieve the specific symptom presentations that had characterized the victim's experiences. Detective Torres testified about the evidence recovered from Stephanie's home, including detailed journals documenting individual children's responses to various medication combinations and communications with other members of her criminal network. The documentation revealed a level of systematic record-keeping that contradicted any claims of good intentions or medical necessity. The defendant maintained detailed notes about which medications produced specific symptoms in different children, Torres explained. She recorded information about dosages, timing, and victim responses that she then shared with other individuals engaged in similar activities in other states. The evidence of coordination with other perpetrators demonstrated that Stephanie's crimes were part of a larger pattern of organized child abuse rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment or experimental medicine. The networking aspect of her criminal behavior showed premeditation and deliberate intent to cause harm. Marcus's testimony provided crucial context about Stephanie's professional background and the recommendation that had led to her employment at Summit Ridge. His obvious remorse about his role in her hiring was painful to witness, but his honest acknowledgement of the deception she had practiced helped establish how effectively she had concealed her criminal tendencies. I worked with Stephanie Walsh for 2 years at Denver General Hospital, Marcus testified. During that time, she demonstrated excellent clinical skills and appropriate professional behavior. I saw nothing that would have suggested she was capable of the systematic abuse of children that we now know occurred at Summit Ridge Elementary. His testimony reinforced the prosecution's argument that Stephanie had deliberately cultivated a professional reputation that would enable her access to vulnerable children, while concealing her abusive intentions from colleagues and supervisors who might have prevented her employment in educational settings. My own testimony focused on the observations and research that had eventually led to exposing Stephanie's crimes. I described the unauthorized medications I had observed in her clinic, the pattern analysis that connected Lucas's symptoms to his school attendance, and the background investigation that revealed her history of disciplinary actions in other states. My pharmaceutical background helped me recognize that sample medications shouldn't have been present in a school health setting, I testified. When I researched Stephanie's professional history, I discovered a pattern of misconduct that should have prevented her employment at any institution serving children. The prosecution used my testimony to highlight both the warning signs that had been missed during Stephanie's hiring and the systematic failures in background checking that had enabled her to continue harming children despite previous incidents of abuse. The most powerful testimony came from the children themselves, who despite their young ages were able to articulate their experiences with remarkable clarity and courage. Lucas was among 8 children who testified about their interactions with Stephanie and the symptoms they had experienced after visiting her clinic. She always seemed really nice and worried about how I felt, Lucas told the jury. But then I would start feeling sick after she gave me medicine, and I didn't understand why the medicine that was supposed to help me was making me feel worse. His ability to describe the confusion and fear he had experienced while trusting someone who was deliberately harming him provided the human context that made Stephanie's crimes emotionally real for the jury members who were considering her fate. The children's testimony was particularly powerful because it demonstrated the psychological manipulation Stephanie had employed alongside her physical abuse. She had maintained caring relationships with her victims while systematically poisoning them, creating confusion and self-doubt that had prevented them from recognizing the source of their suffering. The defense's attempt to discredit the children's testimony by suggesting they had been coached or influenced by their parents backfired spectacularly, when several jury members visibly recoiled at the implication that young victims of abuse were lying about their experiences. The second week of trial focused on expert testimony about the broader criminal network of which Stephanie had been a part. Agent Patricia Summers from the HHS Office of Inspector General testified about the investigation that had uncovered coordinated child abuse activities across multiple states involving healthcare professionals who shared techniques and resources. The defendant was part of an organized network of individuals who used their healthcare credentials to gain access to children for the purpose of systematic abuse, Agent Summers testified. They communicated regularly about medication techniques, victim selection, and methods for avoiding detection while documenting their crimes for sharing with other network members. Her testimony established that Stephanie's actions were not the result of mental illness or misguided attempts to help children, but rather deliberate participation in organized criminal activity designed to facilitate widespread child abuse while maintaining professional credibility. The evidence of Stephanie's participation in the criminal network included encrypted communications describing her, quote, experiments with different medication combinations, and detailed reports about individual children's responses to various drugs. The documentation revealed a level of callousness and scientific detachment that was deeply disturbing to everyone who heard it. Dr. Sarah Chen, Lucas's psychologist, testified about the long-term psychological impact of institutional abuse on children and families. Her analysis helped the jury understand that Stephanie's crimes had caused not only immediate physical harm, but also lasting emotional damage that would require ongoing therapeutic intervention. Children who experience abuse from trusted authority figures suffer profound violations of their basic assumptions about safety and trustworthiness, Dr. Chen explained. The defendant's actions have caused trauma that extends far beyond the physical symptoms of poisoning to include fundamental damage to these children's ability to trust in institutional protection. Her testimony emphasized that the harm caused by Stephanie's crimes could not be measured solely in terms of physical symptoms or medical treatment costs, but also included the psychological damage that would affect her victims throughout their lives. The prosecution's closing argument synthesized the overwhelming evidence of systematic criminal behavior, while emphasizing the betrayal of trust that made Stephanie's crimes particularly heinous. Rodriguez argued that the defendant deserved the maximum penalty allowed by law for her deliberate abuse of children and violation of professional responsibilities. Stephanie Walsh took an oath to do no harm, Rodriguez concluded. Instead, she used her medical knowledge and professional access to systematically poison children while documenting their suffering for her own gratification and that of her criminal associates. She betrayed not only her victims and their families, but also the entire healthcare profession and the community that trusted her with their children's welfare. The defense's closing argument attempted to portray Stephanie as a dedicated healthcare provider whose unconventional methods had been misunderstood and criminalized by a system that feared innovation. Barnes argued that his client deserved leniency based on her years of service and her genuine desire to help children with complex medical needs. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, including multiple counts of child abuse, medication tampering, conspiracy, and practicing medicine without proper authorization. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence, and their conclusion that Stephanie's crimes were both serious and inexcusable. Judge Patricia Williams sentenced Stephanie Walsh to 25 years in prison without possibility of parole, calling her crimes a fundamental betrayal of the trust that forms the foundation of healthcare relationships and child protection systems. The sentence was among the harshest ever imposed in Colorado for institutional child abuse cases. The defendant used her professional credentials and community standing to gain access to vulnerable children for the purpose of systematic abuse, Judge Williams stated during sentencing. Her actions have not only harmed individual victims but also damaged public trust in healthcare institutions and educational systems designed to protect children. The sentence provided a measure of justice for the families who had endured Stephanie's crimes, while sending a strong message about accountability for healthcare professionals who abuse their positions of trust. The lengthy prison term ensured that she would never again have access to children who could become her victims. The civil litigation that followed the criminal trial resulted in significant settlements with Summit Ridge School District and various healthcare credentialing agencies that had failed to detect Stephanie's history of misconduct. More importantly, the legal proceedings forced systemic reforms in background checking procedures, medication monitoring protocols, and staff supervision practices. The Colorado Department of Education implemented new requirements for healthcare credentialing that included mandatory reporting of disciplinary actions between states and enhanced oversight of school health services. These reforms would prevent future situations where individuals with histories of misconduct could move between jurisdictions without disclosure of previous violations. The pharmaceutical diversion scheme that had supplied Stephanie's criminal network was dismantled through coordinated federal enforcement action that resulted in additional prosecutions and regulatory reforms designed to prevent unauthorized access to prescription medications. The investigation led to improved inventory controls and monitoring systems that would make similar diversion activities much more difficult. As our family moved forward from the trauma of Stephanie's abuse, we found purpose in advocacy work designed to protect other children from similar violations. I began speaking at professional conferences and training sessions about recognizing signs of institutional abuse, while Lucas developed remarkable resilience and insight that would serve him throughout his life. I learned that just because someone seems nice doesn't mean they're good, Lucas reflected during one of our conversations about his experience. But I also learned that most people really do want to help, and it's important not to be afraid of everyone just because one person was bad. His ability to maintain appropriate trust while developing healthy skepticism represented the best possible outcome from his traumatic experience. The strength and wisdom he had gained would help him navigate future relationships and institutional interactions with confidence and discernment. The broader impact of Stephanie Walsh's crimes extended far beyond Willow Creek to influence healthcare practices, educational policies, and child protection protocols throughout the region and beyond. Her case became a catalyst for systematic reforms that would help prevent similar abuse while strengthening the institutions designed to keep children safe. 3 years after Stephanie's conviction, Summit Ridge Elementary had become a model for school health services, with enhanced safety protocols, comprehensive staff training, and robust community oversight that ensured transparency and accountability. The trauma that had shattered our community's trust had ultimately led to stronger protections for future generations of children. Lucas thrived academically and socially as he moved through middle school, his experience with institutional abuse having taught him valuable lessons about advocacy, resilience, and the importance of speaking up when something doesn't feel right. His confidence in his own judgment and his ability to seek help when needed would serve him well throughout his life. Our family's journey from victims of systematic abuse to advocates for child protection demonstrated that even the most profound violations of trust could be transformed into forces for positive change. The pain and fear we had experienced became the foundation for work that would help protect other children while strengthening the systems designed to keep them safe. As I watched Lucas excel in his new school environment, surrounded by healthcare professionals and educators committed to his genuine welfare, I reflected on how completely our understanding of safety and trust had been transformed. We had learned to maintain appropriate vigilance without allowing fear to dominate our relationships with legitimate caregivers and institutions. The legacy of Stephanie Walsh's crimes would be measured not only in the justice achieved through her prosecution, but also in the systematic reforms that emerged from the investigation of her activities. The children she had harmed would grow up in a world with stronger protections and greater awareness of institutional abuse, making their suffering meaningful in ways that honored their courage and resilience. Our story had become part of a larger narrative about the importance of vigilance, advocacy, and systematic reform in protecting children from those who would exploit positions of trust for harmful purposes. The transformation from victims to advocates represented the most powerful response to the violation we had endured, ensuring that our experience would help prevent similar trauma for other families. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.